The streets of 17th-century Genoa were alive with the scent of salt from the harbor, the glitter of fine silks from distant lands, and the low murmur of deals being struck behind closed doors. In this city of soaring fortunes and sudden ruin, one name carried more weight than gold: Brignole. To be born into this family was to inherit a legacy of vast wealth, powerful connections, and a reputation that reached far beyond the city walls. It was a world where opulence was not just a privilege but a way of life, and at its center was Maria Brignole. From the moment she could walk, Maria was surrounded by beauty and grandeur. The halls she roamed were lined with paintings by master artists, and the gowns she wore were woven from the finest fabrics shipped from far-off ports. Every meal was a display of abundance, every gathering a showcase of the family's influence. To the outside world, her life seemed perfect, a golden path laid before her, promising a future as brilliant as the chandeliers that lit her family's grand salons. But behind the dazzling displays of wealth, another reality quietly took shape. The Brignole power rested on more than fine trade goods and noble manners. Their influence reached deep into the tangled web of Genoese politics, where promises were traded like coins and alliances could shift overnight. Friends could become rivals in the space of a single conversation, and a misplaced word could topple even the mightiest from their place at the table. Maria was too young to see the dangers at first, too sheltered by the very walls that kept her safe. Yet the same walls also kept her caged. She was taught to speak with charm, to dance with grace, and to smile at those she might never trust. Each lesson, each expectation, was meant to prepare her for a role that had been decided long before she was born. She would marry well, bear children, and help secure the family's power for another generation. And in doing so, she would never step outside the gilded boundaries drawn for her. It was a destiny that glittered from a distance, but like gold leaf, it could flake away under pressure to reveal the wood beneath. What no one could predict was how quickly the world around her would shift, and how Maria herself would change with it. Beneath her polished exterior lay a sharp mind and a restless spirit, one that would soon be tested by betrayal, loss, and the unraveling of the life she had always known. Her story would not follow the path her family had planned. Instead, it would become a tale of survival, reinvention, and the quiet power of resilience in the face of a world determined to write her ending for her. Welcome to our channel Words of Time. And in this video, we will uncover the extraordinary life of Maria Brignole, from the heights of privilege to the depths of loss, and the remarkable journey that reshaped her destiny forever. Brignole was a name that carried weight far beyond the narrow streets and sunlit piazzas of Genoa. In the 17th century, it was not simply a surname but a signal of wealth, influence, and a kind of social authority that few could rival. The Brignoles were counted among the city's most powerful patrician families, woven into the political and mercantile fabric of a republic that owed much of its prosperity to the sea. To speak the name was to conjure images of sprawling palazzi with frescoed ceilings, private chapels adorned with gilded altars, and vast estates that stretched beyond the city's walls into the rolling Ligurian hills. It was also to evoke the quiet but undeniable sway that such a family could hold over decisions in the Senate, over trade agreements with far-off kingdoms, and over the very image of Genoa itself as a place of refinement and dignity. Maria was born into this world of privilege, her earliest breaths taken in rooms where silk curtains filtered the Mediterranean light, and the air itself seemed heavy with perfume and expectation. From the moment she could walk, she inhabited a space that was carefully curated for beauty and grandeur. The marble under her feet was polished to a mirror-like sheen, and every corridor she wandered seemed to echo with the footsteps of ancestors whose portraits gazed down from the walls with stern, knowing eyes. Her toys were not the simple wooden trinkets of ordinary children, but miniature marvels carved from ivory, inlaid with mother-of-pearl, and painted in delicate colors by skilled artisans. Her clothing was stitched from the finest imported fabrics, dyed in shades that merchants brought back from the East, and trimmed with lace so intricate it could only have been made by the most patient hands in Venice or Flanders. This was the life of a Brignole daughter, a seamless blend of opulence and decorum, where every meal was served on silver, and every outing was an event worthy of notice. There were lessons in music, in poetry, in languages spoken across Europe. There were dances to learn, etiquette to master, and a constant awareness that her behavior reflected not only upon herself, but upon an entire lineage. She was told, gently but firmly, that she carried the honor of her family with her wherever she went. In public, she was the embodiment of the Brignole ideal, poised, gracious, and always aware of her place in the order of things. The source of this wealth and stature was as much political as it was mercantile. The Brignoles had built their fortune through maritime trade, leveraging Genoa's position as a critical port along Mediterranean route. They owned shares in shipping ventures that carried goods from Spain, from the Levant, and from the ports of North Africa. They had invested in banking, a field in which Genoese financiers were among the most trusted in Europe, often extending credit to monarchs and funding military campaigns far beyond the city's shores. Their influence reached into the highest offices of the Republic, with family members serving as senators, ambassadors, and even doges. These positions were not merely ceremonial. They allowed the Brignoles to shape laws, secure lucrative contracts, and maintain alliances that kept their fortune growing year after year. Maria grew up hearing fragments of these matters spoken in the drawing rooms where her father and uncles met with men of similar standing. While she did not yet understand the intricacies of trade tariffs or maritime insurance, she absorbed the rhythm of the conversation, the air of authority with which her elders spoke, and the subtle deference they commanded from guests. In her young mind, this was simply the natural order. The Brignoles at the center, others orbiting around them. Yet even in those early years, before the full weight of her family's expectations settled upon her, there were hints of the constraints she lived within. She was never alone, always accompanied by a nurse, a governess, or an attendant. Her interactions were carefully monitored. The children she played with were chosen for her, their families vetted for status and respectability. Her clothing, her words, even the expression on her face in public were matters of gentle correction and training. A Brignole daughter was not to run too quickly in the gardens lest she appear unladylike, nor to laugh too loudly at supper lest she be thought coarse. She was told these rules were for her own good, but they also ensured she would grow into exactly the kind of woman the family needed her to be, a fitting ornament to their name, a strategic partner in the alliances they would one day forge. There was, too, a constant undercurrent of conversation about marriage, spoken in the way that adults speak around children when they imagine the child is too young to truly listen. Suitors were discussed as if they were investments, each potential match weighed for what it could bring in terms of property, influence, or political leverage. Maria heard her name paired with surnames she did not know. The talk of dowries and inheritances flowing as naturally as the discussion of crops or ships. She came to understand, without being told outright, that her life's path was already sketched in fine lines, its borders drawn long before she had any say in the matter. The grandeur of her surroundings made it easy to believe she was blessed beyond measure. The family palazzo was a world unto itself, its high windows framing the harbor where the family's ships came and went. Beyond the ornate gates, the streets of Genoa bustled with merchants and laborers, but inside, the air was calm and perfumed, and the noise of the city seemed far away. From the balconies, she could see the rooftops of other noble houses, each a testament to the wealth that trade and politics had brought to the Republic. But if she lingered long enough, she could also glimpse the humbler quarters beyond, where the walls were rough and the windows small, and where the people who served in her household returned at night to lives she would never truly know. This was the paradox of Maria's childhood. To live in beauty and abundance while being unaware that such abundance was a kind of confinement. She was the cherished daughter of a house that saw itself as destined for greatness, and she believed in that destiny because she had never known anything else. Yet the very perfection of her world was a mask that hid the limits it placed upon her. Behind the silks and the jewels, behind the lessons and the praise, there was an unspoken truth, that her role had been chosen for her, and that every kindness, every privilege, came with the price of obedience. It was a truth she could not yet name, but its presence was there in the small moments. In the way conversations would stop when she entered a room, in the sidelong glances between her elders when she spoke too freely, in the gentle but firm reminders of how a Brignole daughter ought to behave. These were the bars of her golden cage, and though they were gilded with the finest gold Genoa could offer, they were still bars all the same. Maria's earliest sense of the world was shaped not only by the grandeur of her own home, but also by the deliberate way her family shielded her from the raw edges of life. When she was still very small, she was taken to the Brignole country estate in the hills above the city. There, the air smelled of rosemary and pine, and the sound of the sea was softened by distance. The gardens were designed in intricate patterns, with gravel paths that crunched under her shoes and fountains where marble figures poured water from urns into pools ringed by lilies. Servants moved quietly along these paths, pruning roses or carrying baskets of herbs to the kitchens. To Maria, these figures seemed as much a part of the estate as the statues and the trees, present constant, yet existing in a world parallel to hers, one she was never invited to enter. Her father often spoke of the land as a foundation for the family's prosperity. The hills yielded olives and grapes that were pressed into oil and wine, products sold under the Brignole name, their quality assured by centuries of cultivation. But the estate was more than a source of revenue. It was a retreat where important guests could be entertained away from the eyes of the city, where negotiations could take place over long, measured meals, and where Maria's elders could weave the delicate threads of alliances without interruption. She was too young to participate in these discussions, but she learned to read their importance in the expressions of those who emerged from them. The satisfied set of a mouth after a bargain was struck, the pensive silence when terms were not agreed upon. The rhythms of her days were as carefully managed as any ledger in her father's counting house. She rose at the same hour each morning to be dressed by her governess, then taken to the schoolroom where her tutors awaited. One taught her to read and write in Italian, another to speak French with a proper accent, and still another instructed her in Latin phrases considered essential for a person of refinement. Music lessons filled the late morning. She learned to coax clear notes from a lute, and to read the ornate notation of madrigals. The afternoons brought drawing lessons, embroidery practice, or walks in the gardens under the watchful eye of an attendant. There was little room for idleness, and none at all for unsupervised exploration. At first, she accepted this structure without question. It was simply the way things were. Only as she grew older did she begin to notice that the freedom of movement she saw in the streets below the palazzo did not exist for her. From her window she could watch children chasing one another along the docks, their laughter carrying upward with the cries of gulls. She saw women bargaining for fish, men rolling barrels toward waiting ships, and apprentices hurrying at the call of their masters. These scenes were colorful and lively, but they belonged to a world in the evenings. The great hall of the palazzo would fill with the glow of candlelight reflected in mirrors framed in gold leaf. Guests arrived in fine carriages, greeted at the door by liveried servants. Maria was often brought forward to be introduced, standing beside her mother with her hands clasped, smiling politely at strangers who assessed her with appraising eyes. The talk at these gatherings flowed between politics, art, and trade, and though much of it passed over her head, she sensed its seriousness. She also began to understand her own part in these occasions, to charm, to display grace, and to suggest, without words, that she would one day be an asset to whichever alliance the family chose for her. The wealth of the Brignole family did not rest solely on commerce and land. They also held valuable connections with other noble houses, both within Genoa and abroad. These relationships were maintained through a web of mutual favors, shared ventures, and intermarriage. To outsiders, it might have seemed that Maria's future was filled with limitless choice, but within the walls of the palazzo the reality was different. Choice was an illusion. Each potential match would be evaluated for its political advantage, its financial security, and its capacity to strengthen the Brignole position. Love was not entirely dismissed, but it was a distant consideration, one that could not be allowed to interfere with strategy. Her mother, a woman of sharp intellect and quiet authority, understood this system intimately. She had herself been married into the Brignole family for the sake of consolidating property and influence, and she had embraced her role with dignity. She oversaw the household with precision, from the ordering of supplies to the management of servants, ensuring that every guest was impressed by the seamless operation of their home. To Maria, her mother seemed unshakable, her calm presence a constant in a world that revolved around appearances. But in rare, unguarded moments, she would speak softly to her daughter about the importance of patience, of listening more than speaking, and of guarding one's thoughts until the right moment to reveal them. These lessons were subtle, but they planted in Maria the sense that life within her golden world required more than beauty and obedience. It required an ability to navigate undercurrents, to read intentions behind polite words, and to anticipate the moves of others in a game that was always being played, even in the quietest rooms. Her father was a figure of both warmth and distance. He was generous with affection when present, but his duties often took him away from home for weeks at a time. He traveled to oversee shipping ventures, to attend sessions of the Senate, and to visit estates in other regions. When he returned, he brought with him gifts: a bolt of silk from Lyon, a carved box from Spain, or a small volume of poetry from Florence, each chosen to remind Maria that she was in his thoughts even when far away. These moments of reunion were joyful, but they also underscored his absence. Maria learned early that men of her family bore the weight of public life, and that the women supported that life from within the household. Despite the wealth and refinement surrounding her, there were glimpses of hardship in the world beyond her gates. During one particularly harsh winter, she noticed the number of beggars at the edges of the piazza increase. Their figures were thin beneath worn cloaks, their hands outstretched toward anyone passing by. Maria's governess instructed her to avert her gaze, but she could not help feeling a quiet unease. These people lived in the same city, breathed the same air, yet their lives were entirely different from her own. It was not pity she felt so much as curiosity, a wondering about how such differences came to be, and whether they were as permanent as they seemed. Her curiosity was not encouraged. When she asked questions about the people she saw in the streets, the answers were polite but dismissive. Such matters were beyond her concern, she was told. A Brignole's duty was to maintain the dignity of her station, not to trouble herself with the affairs of those in other walks of life. The cage was not only built of rules and expectations, but also of carefully limited knowledge. Maria's days passed in this manner, a blend of disciplined study, orchestrated appearances, and moments of private reflection. She learned to hide her thoughts behind a composed expression, to smile when expected, and to offer compliments in the right measure. The more she mastered these skills, the more she was praised, and the praise itself became a kind of currency in her world. But beneath the polished exterior, there grew a quiet awareness that her life, for all its comfort, was not entirely her own. The rooms of the palazzo, however grand, began to feel smaller as she understood the role she was expected to play. Her world was vast in wealth and influence, yet narrow in freedom. And though she could not yet name the feeling, she sensed that the years ahead would test her ability to balance the demands of her family with the stirrings of her own will. The season that marked the beginning of Maria's undoing did not announce itself with storms or disasters. It came quietly, in days that seemed as unremarkable as any she had lived before. Yet beneath the surface of Genoa's elegance, there were currents shifting in ways she could not see. Trade routes were changing, alliances between noble families were being tested, and the balance of influence within the Senate had begun to tilt. For generations, the Brignole name had been shield enough against such changes, but even a fortress built on centuries of wealth can be weakened when those within it grow complacent. Maria was in her early womanhood then, poised on the threshold between the sheltered grace of her youth and the full responsibilities of her station. The marriage arrangements that had long been discussed in hushed tones were nearing final form. Suitors were still being considered, yet one name had begun to dominate the conversations between her father and his most trusted advisors. He was from a family that, while less ancient than the Brignoles, had risen swiftly in wealth through ventures in the East. They offered significant resources, but they also sought the legitimacy that a union with her name could provide. It was during this time that a man named Lorenzo di Vivaldi entered the picture. He was not the suitor, but rather a close confidant to her father, a man whose presence in the household was explained as purely political. Lorenzo was a figure of subtle charm and sharp calculation, with a reputation for bridging the worlds of commerce and politics. He could sit at a merchant's table and speak of cargo weights and tariffs, then step into a noble salon and converse on art and philosophy with equal fluency. To Maria, he seemed a man who could walk through any door and leave it slightly more open behind him. Lorenzo's involvement in family matters deepened quickly. He began advising her father on matters of trade, proposing new investments, and hinting at opportunities that could secure the Brignole fortune for decades to come. Yet not all of his counsel was free of risk. There were whispers in the city that his dealings in the East were tied to volatile markets, and that his alliances were as changeable as the wind. Maria noticed, too, that when he spoke to her father, there was often an undertone of urgency, as though some matter needed resolution before others could act. Her mother, ever perceptive, voiced quiet concern in private. She reminded her husband that the family's strength had always rested on steady, measured growth rather than daring gambles. But her warnings were brushed aside with reassurances that Lorenzo's insight was exactly what was needed in a changing world. Maria, caught between these opposing views, felt a shadow of unease, though she could not have said why. The first true crack in the golden facade came when one of Lorenzo's ventures faltered. A shipment of valuable goods was seized in a dispute at a foreign port, and the loss was greater than her father had anticipated. To cover the debt, certain assets were shifted, and arrangements that had once seemed secure began to loosen. It was not ruin, but it was a shift in footing, and in the high halls of Genoese politics, even a small misstep could invite rivals to press closer. At the same time, Maria's engagement negotiations encountered unexpected resistance. The family of the intended suitor began to hesitate, citing the unsettled financial reports that had begun to circulate in the city. They were polite, but their questions grew sharper, their terms more demanding. Her father's pride was stung, and Maria sensed in him a growing desperation to prove the Brignoles were still beyond reproach. It was in this atmosphere of quiet strain that the true betrayal took root. A distant cousin, Carlo Brignole, had long harbored ambitions of his own. He had served in minor offices within the Republic, gaining enough influence to move in important circles, but never enough to command them. To him, Lorenzo's growing role in the family was an opening, one he could exploit. Carlo began feeding information to certain members of the Senate, suggesting that the Brignoles were placing too much trust in an outsider whose loyalties were uncertain. He hinted that Maria's marriage alliance was being delayed not by choice but by necessity, and that the family's fortunes were in quiet decline. At the same time, he worked to position himself as a more stable alternative for those seeking to align with the Brignole name. His aim was not to destroy the family outright, but to shift the center of its power into his own hands. Lorenzo, for his part, seemed unaware or unwilling to see the danger. He pressed forward with his plans, even as the currents of gossip and suspicion swelled around them. Then came the meeting that would mark the point of no return. A gathering of influential senators was called to discuss the renewal of a critical trade charter in which the Brignoles held a significant share. Maria's father arrived confident, expecting the usual affirmation of their role. Instead, he was met with a sudden and coordinated challenge. Led in part by Carlo and supported by those who had been swayed by months of whispered doubt, the vote went against them. The charter was awarded to a coalition of merchants and nobles led by none other than the family of Maria's intended suitor, effectively severing both the business and marital ties that had been in the making for years. The loss was more than financial. It was a public blow to their standing, a signal that the Brignoles were no longer untouchable. The aftermath was swift and brutal in the world of Genoese politics. Invitations to certain gatherings stopped arriving. Trusted allies became distant. Creditors who once offered favorable terms began to demand stricter assurances. Within weeks, the family that had once been spoken of with unshakable respect was navigating a world where every move was watched for signs of weakness. For Maria, the change was disorienting. The halls of the palazzo, once filled with guests and lively conversation, grew quieter. Her father was often absent, locked in meetings with advisors or away on urgent visits to secure new partnerships. Her mother's composure remained outwardly intact, but in the privacy of her chambers Maria saw the toll it was taking. The drawn lines around her mouth, the long silences between words. Maria herself was not spared the sting of this reversal. Where once she had been greeted with deference, she now encountered subtle but undeniable slights. Women who had once sought her company now offered only polite smiles before turning to others. Conversations would falter when she approached, as if her presence reminded them of something better left unsaid. Even her suitors, those who might have sought her hand for beauty alone, seemed to vanish from the circle of possibility. In the midst of this, she learned the full truth of the betrayal. A letter meant for her father was delivered to her by mistake. A correspondence from Carlo to a senator in which he spoke of the necessary pruning of family influence and hinted at his own readiness to assume a more prominent role. The words were couched in careful politeness, but to Maria they read like a knife's edge. She understood then that this was not merely the result of unfortunate circumstances, but a deliberate move against them by one who shared their blood. The knowledge left her shaken, but also sharpened. The world she had known, built on trust in family and the stability of tradition, was gone. In its place was a world where survival depended on reading the intentions of others and guarding one's own plans with the utmost care. She felt anger, yes, but beneath it a deep sorrow for the loss of something more fragile. The belief that her life, while constrained, had been secure. The letter from Carlo had opened a door Maria could never close. Once she had seen his words, she began to notice other signs she had overlooked. Servants spoke in lowered voices when she passed, and their glances lingered in ways that hinted at knowledge not meant for her. Guests who had once greeted her with warm familiarity now studied her with an odd mix of curiosity and caution. It was not only the family's loss of power that shadowed her. Something deeper seemed to ripple beneath the surface, as if old currents had been stirred by the recent storm. The first whisper came from a source she would have dismissed in other times. An older servant, who had been in her mother's household before her marriage to her father, approached Maria late one afternoon with a hesitant air. In the privacy of a side corridor, she murmured that not all of the Brignoles' troubles were born of politics. There were matters from the past, she hinted, that certain people in the city had long kept quiet. Matters that, if spoken openly, could ruin more than reputations. Maria pressed for details, but the woman only shook her head and said it was dangerous to know too much unless one was prepared to act. This hint gnawed at her. For nights she lay awake replaying every conversation, every unexplained look, searching for patterns. It was during one of these restless vigils that she remembered an incident from her childhood, a brief and unremarkable moment that now seemed cast in a different light. She had been perhaps no more than 10, passing by her father's study, when she saw him hastily close a ledger as her mother entered the room. His voice had been calm, but there had been a certain tension in his posture, a glance exchanged between them that spoke of something unspoken. At the time she thought nothing of it. Now it returned to her with a sharper edge. The truth began to take form slowly, pieced together from overheard remarks, old family letters stored in a locked cabinet, and the careful probing of those who might speak if they believed their words would not be carried further. The Brignole fortune, it seemed, had not always been built upon ventures entirely within the law. In her grandfather's time, and perhaps even earlier, certain trade agreements had been underwritten by silent partnerships with men who operated outside the boundaries of the Republic's rules. Ships bearing the Brignole crest had carried goods declared under one name, but sold under another in distant ports, avoiding taxes and tariffs through arrangements that could never withstand official scrutiny. Worse still, some of these dealings had bound the family in quiet obligation to foreign interests whose loyalty was to profit alone. These connections, dormant for years, had resurfaced when Lorenzo began his ventures in the East. To some within the Senate, this history was a weapon waiting to be used, and Carlo had not hesitated to place it in the right hands. But there were other secrets, more personal and less easily spoken of. Among the letters Maria found was a packet tied with faded ribbon, hidden in the false bottom of an old writing desk. They were written in her mother's hand, but not addressed to her father. The tone was tender, even urgent, speaking of meetings in secluded gardens and of feelings that could not be shown in the light of day. The name of the recipient was never written in full, only the initial, A. The final letter was a farewell, written in a trembling script, suggesting that the affair, if that was what it had been, had ended abruptly. Maria could not know whether her father had ever discovered these letters, but she could imagine how knowledge of them in the wrong circles could become another instrument of ruin. In the weeks that followed, fragments of these truths began to find their way into the city's undercurrent of gossip. A merchant's wife, speaking too loudly at a gathering, alluded to old debts that had come due. A senator's nephew claimed to know of correspondence between a Brignole and a foreign envoy that had vanished from official records. Even the vaguest of rumors, once attached to a name as storied as hers, carried the weight of scandal. Maria felt the walls of her life shift again, not with the sudden blow of the charter's loss, but with the slow erosion of trust. Friends avoided certain topics in her presence. Strangers watched her as if measuring how much she knew. She began to suspect that even those closest to her were keeping their distance out of fear that proximity might draw unwanted attention. Yet these revelations, painful as they were, also brought a strange kind of clarity. The gilded cage of her youth had hidden from her not only the limits placed upon her freedom, but the flawed foundations of the world she had been taught to trust. If the perfection she once believed in had been an illusion, then perhaps she was freer now than she had ever been. Not in position or privilege, but in sight. She could see the game for what it was, and she could choose how, or if she would play it. Her first test came when a discreet invitation reached her, delivered by a man who claimed to be acting on behalf of an old ally of the family. The message hinted at knowledge of the Brignoles' private dealings, and proposed a meeting in a secluded villa outside the city. It was framed as an opportunity to reclaim some measure of influence, perhaps even to restore part of what had been lost. But the language was careful, and Maria sensed that accepting might draw her deeper into the very web that had ensnared her family. She agreed to go, not out of trust, but because she needed to know how far the threads of the past still reached. The villa was modest by noble standards, yet the man who greeted her carried himself with the assurance of someone accustomed to power. He introduced himself as Alessandro di Carati, a name she recognized from older records as one of the merchants once entangled with her grandfather's ventures. In the privacy of a shaded courtyard, he spoke plainly. He knew of the family's history, he said, and of the connections that had been reawakened through Lorenzo's trade in the East. These ties, if handled carefully, could be turned to her advantage. But it would require discretion, the willingness to forge new alliances outside the bounds of tradition, and the acceptance of certain risks. Maria listened, weighing each word. She had been taught all her life that honor lay in the preservation of the family's name, yet she now understood that the name itself had long been maintained by compromises hidden from view. The choice before her was not between honor and disgrace, but between action and irrelevance. The days after that meeting were filled with reflection. She moved through the quiet corridors of the palazzo, touching the carved banisters polished by generations of hands, looking into the painted faces of her ancestors, and wondering how many had carried secrets of their own. The cage remained, but the door stood slightly ajar, and for the first time she considered what it might mean to step beyond it, even if the ground outside was uncertain. She did not yet decide, but she began to keep her own counsel, to speak less and listen more, to note who sought her company and who withdrew. She made small moves. A private word to a merchant here, a shared confidence with a senator's wife there, each chosen to test the waters without committing herself fully. The whispers of the past had shaped her fall, but they also offered the map of a different path forward, one that could lead to restoration or to deeper entrapment, depending on how she navigated it. And so, in the shadow of betrayal and loss, Maria began to carry her secrets not as a burden but as a currency, one she would spend only when the cost and the gain were both clear. The world that had once seemed fixed and perfect now shifted like the sea beyond Genoa's harbor, and she, at last, had learned to watch the tide. Maria's decision to treat her secrets as a kind of currency marked the quiet beginning of her transformation. For so long she had been defined by the boundaries of her upbringing, moving through life as though the lines drawn around her were unchangeable. But now, in the aftermath of betrayal and scandal, she saw those lines for what they were. The limits others had chosen for her, not the limits of her own will. The loss of her family's untouchable status had stripped her of the protective illusions that once shielded her from the harsher truths of the world. What remained was a woman no longer content to be merely a symbol of refinement. Her first steps toward adaptation were not grand gestures. They began in the smallest of decisions, each one a deliberate choice to reclaim control. She refused to retreat entirely from public life, despite the murmurs that still followed her. Instead, she began to appear in settings where no Brignole would once have been expected: the quieter salons of lesser-known households, intimate gatherings of merchants' wives, even the occasional public celebration in the piazza. These spaces were beneath the notice of most in her former circle, yet they offered something she had never experienced before: conversations that were unguarded, honest, and unconcerned with maintaining an image. It was in one such gathering that she met Sofia Aliprandi, the daughter of a shipbuilder who had risen to moderate prosperity through his own skill rather than inherited wealth. Sophia was quick-witted, her humor edged with the bluntness of someone who had never needed to court the favor of nobles. At first, Maria was taken aback by her directness, but she soon found it refreshing. There was no calculation in Sophia's words, no careful weighing of what might please or offend. Over time, their conversations became a refuge for Maria, a place where she could speak without fear that her every phrase would be dissected for hidden meaning. Through Sophia, she began to see another side of Genoa, the bustling shipyards, the workshops where craftsmen labored over intricate carvings, the markets alive with barter and trade. It was a world that had always existed beneath her, yet one she had been taught to ignore. Now, stripped of the obligation to preserve the illusion of superiority, she moved through it with growing curiosity. The people she met judged her not for the alliances her family had lost, but for how she listened, how she remembered their names, how she treated them as worthy of her attention. Her path forward also drew upon the very skills her upbringing had instilled. Years of training in diplomacy, language, and observation had left her well-equipped to navigate delicate conversations. Where others might see a mere exchange of pleasantries, she recognized the opening of a door. Slowly, she began to piece together a network that was not based on shared lineage, but on mutual trust and the exchange of useful knowledge. One of the most unexpected alliances came in the form of Tommaso Ruggieri, a merchant whose family had once competed fiercely with the Brignoles for trade contracts. Tommaso was older, with a weathered face and the air of a man who had seen too many deals go sour to be easily impressed. Their first meeting was accidental, a chance encounter in a small bookshop where Maria was searching for a volume on maritime law. Recognizing her name, Tommaso at first regarded her with open suspicion, but her questions about shipping practices and foreign tariffs intrigued him. He agreed to meet again, and their discussions grew into an exchange of information that benefited them both. She gained insight into the mechanics of trade beyond her childhood lessons, and he gained access to the subtle political intelligence she could still gather in the social sphere. With each passing month, she felt less like a figure surviving on the remnants of her family's former glory, and more like a woman crafting something entirely her own. The knowledge she had gathered about her family's past, the illicit dealings, the dangerous alliances, was no longer a burden pressing her down, but a set of tools she could choose to use when the moment was right. She never threatened openly, never revealed more than she intended, but those who might have dismissed her began to think twice before underestimating her. Her resilience was not born solely of strategy, but of a quiet refusal to be diminished. There were nights when the memories of the betrayal returned sharply, when the weight of what had been lost threatened to overwhelm her. Yet in those moments she would recall the women she had met outside her former circle, Sophia with her laughter that could cut through gloom, the market vendors who greeted her with genuine warmth, the shipyard workers who spoke proudly of their craft. In their company she found a sense of belonging that no title could have given her. In time, her efforts began to bear fruit. Small investments made through discreet intermediaries started to yield returns. Partnerships formed quietly, avoiding the scrutiny that had once surrounded every Brignole venture. These successes were not the grand triumphs of her family's past, but they were hers, shaped by her decisions and her willingness to adapt. Maria's transformation did not go unnoticed. Some in the old nobility regarded her with a mix of fascination and discomfort, uncertain how to place a woman who had stepped beyond the prescribed role for someone of her birth. Others, particularly younger women chafing under similar constraints, saw in her a model of what might be possible. She did not seek to become a symbol, but she could not entirely avoid the influence her example carried. Perhaps the most telling change was within herself. Where once she had measured her worth by the standards of her family and the approval of her peers, she now measured it by her ability to act according to her own judgment. She no longer feared the whispers, for she understood that they were inevitable, and that sometimes they could even be turned to her advantage. Her new path was not without danger. The alliances she had formed were fragile, and the balance between caution and ambition was delicate. Yet she faced these risks with a steadiness she had never possessed in the days when her future had been laid out for her like a map. The loss that had once seemed the end of her story had become the beginning of another, one she could shape with her own hands. And so Maria stepped into her altered reality not as the heiress she had been, but as the woman she had become, one who had learned that resilience is not the absence of hardship, but the will to rise each time the ground shifts beneath you. The gilded cage had fallen away, the whispers of the past had become the tools of the present, and the horizon before her was no longer dictated by the expectations of others, but by the course she chose to set. The years that followed did not unfold with the grandeur of her youth, but they carried a quiet weight that Maria came to value more than the glittering spectacle of her early life. Her position in Genoa never returned to what it had been when the Brignole name commanded unquestioned deference. That world, she came to understand, was gone not only for her, but for many of the noble houses that had seemed immovable in her childhood. Trade shifted to new hands, political alliances dissolved and reformed, and the city itself began to reshape in ways that left less room for the old certainties of patrician dominance. Yet she did not vanish into obscurity. Her influence, though subtler, was no less real for being unseen. She learned to move in the spaces between formal power, where relationships were not forged in public proclamations, but in quiet conversations over shared wine, in discreet favors extended without expectation of immediate return. The alliances she built were rooted not in the unyielding stone of family legacy, but in the more flexible bonds of mutual respect and usefulness. It was a slower kind of power, one that relied on patience and the ability to let others believe they were the architects of their own advantage. There were those who said she had remade herself into a figure whose presence in a room could alter its tone without a single word spoken. Merchants sought her counsel when considering ventures into uncertain markets, not because she could command fleets as her ancestors had, but because she understood the undercurrents of politics and the unspoken bargains that kept trade flowing. Younger women, even those from families who still clung to their fading titles, sought her advice on how to navigate the shifting social order. Some of them would marry well by the old definitions, securing wealth and position. Others would take paths that their grandmothers could never have imagined. In time, even her detractors acknowledged that she had achieved something rare. She had survived a fall from a height that would have crushed many, and had done so without retreating into bitterness or resignation. There were still whispers, of course. The scandals of the past, the betrayals, and the old family dealings had not been forgotten entirely. But these were now told less as accusations and more as the inevitable shadows cast by a life lived within the entanglements of wealth and ambition. For her family, her story became both a caution and an example. The younger Brignoles, though fewer in number and far less wealthy than before, grew up hearing of how Maria had weathered the worst of the family's decline and found a way to remain relevant. Some took her resilience as a guide, learning to adapt to the times rather than clinging to the past. Others treated her tale as a warning of how easily fortune could be lost when ambition and trust were misplaced. In this way, she became a mirror for the family's shifting identity, a reminder of both its vulnerabilities and its capacity for reinvention. The city, too, carried traces of her presence. Genoa was a place that thrived on the exchange of goods and ideas, and Maria's quiet facilitation of connections between merchants, craftsmen, and smaller political players left a subtle imprint. A trade agreement here, a restored alliance there. None of these bore her name in the official record, yet those who were involved knew the part she had played. It was said that her influence was like the tide. You might not notice it at first, but over time you could see how it had reshaped the shoreline. Beyond Genoa, her story took on a different shape. Travelers and chroniclers who passed through the city carried tales of the once great Brignole heiress who had fallen from grace and found a way to live beyond the limits of her inheritance. Some embellished her life with imagined lovers or secret fortunes. Others turned her into a symbol of the decline of the old nobility. In the telling and retelling, she became part of a broader narrative about the fragility of power in a world that could change with the turn of a tide, or the loss of a single alliance. To those who knew her, however, the lesson was simpler and far more personal. She had shown that survival did not always mean restoring what was lost. Sometimes it meant building something entirely new from what remained. She had learned to value the kind of influence that could not be taken away with a vote or a decree. The influence that came from understanding people, from reading the spaces between their words, from knowing when to speak and when to let silence carry the weight. In her later years, Maria was often seen walking along the quieter stretches of the harbor, her steps unhurried, her gaze fixed on the horizon. To some, she appeared a relic of another time, dressed in garments that carried echoes of older fashions. To others, she was a living reminder that the measure of a life is not the grandeur of its beginning, but the strength and clarity with which it is lived to its end. Her legacy was not a palace or a fortune, but a pattern of resilience woven into the lives of those she had touched. The Brignole name would never again stand as it had in the days of her childhood, but neither would it vanish entirely from the city's memory. It endured in quieter ways, in the alliances and friendships she had fostered, in the opportunities she had opened for others, and in the subtle reminder that even the most gilded cage is still a cage, and that there is strength in finding the key to its lock. For those who reflect on her life now, whether in the context of family history or the broader sweep of Genoese society, the lesson is as sharp as it is enduring. Wealth and power are currents, not anchors. They can lift you high or pull you under, and they are never truly still. The only true stability lies in the ability to adapt, to read the changes in the wind and the water, and to steer toward a horizon that you choose for yourself. Maria's story is not only that of a fall from grace, but of the grace found in rising again, shaped not by the world she was born into, but by the woman she chose to become.
Maria's life shows that even when everything changes and the world feels against you, there is always a way forward. She began in comfort and luxury, lost almost all she knew, and yet found a new path by learning, adapting, and building trust with people who valued her for more than her name. Her journey was not about getting back everything she lost, but about making something meaningful from what was left. She proved that strength is not only shown in victory, but in how you rise after a fall. Her story reminds us that wealth and power can disappear, but character, courage, and kindness can last a lifetime. Life will always bring change, and sometimes we cannot control what is taken from us. What we control is how we respond. Maria chose to live with dignity, to keep learning, and to create a new life for herself. That choice became her true legacy, and it is lesson for all of us that the greatest success is to keep going, even when the future looks uncertain.